They're bizarre, but they're true tales from America's history. Many of them you may never have heard before. Are they the result of coincidence or the hand of providence? Michael Medved leaves no doubt in the pages of his latest book. Take a look.
You might call them the accidents or bizarre coincidences of history, but author Michael Medved calls them flat-out miracles that shaped America's destiny. Like the time Theodore Roosevelt was shot in the chest by a would-be assassin while campaigning for president, but the bullet hit a folded-up speech in his jacket pocket and saved his life. Or when U.S. planes got lost over empty ocean during the Battle of Midway, then miraculously reconnected for 5 minutes of dive bombing that wrecked Japan's fleet, convincing even enemy commanders that higher powers intervened against them. Or how Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State, William Seward, miraculously survived a knife attack, allowing him 2 years later to acquire Alaska for the United States. These stories and more are told in Medved's latest book, God's Hand on America, Divine Providence in the Modern Era.
Author and radio host Michael Medved joins us now. Michael, it's so good to see you again.
It's great to see you, Pat.
Hey, listen, it was Obama was asked, is America exceptional? And he said, oh, no. His father was, a Kenyan, and there are a lot of exceptional people. You really believe America is exceptional, don't you?
Well, I do. And what's interesting is Obama, even at the end of his administration, came around to that. And what's remarkable to me is how many of our leaders, right through our history, including people like Franklin Roosevelt and John Kennedy, understood that there was something beyond understanding in this country. And I mean, lots of people say that America is the product of a series of happy accidents, but a pattern of happy accidents is still a pattern. That's evidence of intelligent design, if I can use that term.
You certainly can.
Instead of random evolution.
So it's intelligent that God himself has been looking after this nation since its founding. It is exceptional then, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And by the way, Martin Luther King believed that. I have one of my last chapters in the book is about Dr. King, who prophesied his own death, prophesied its meaning, and actually deeply, deeply believed. There's a story that people should remember on Martin Luther King Day about what he called the kitchen table conversion, where God spoke to him in 1957 in the midst of the Montgomery bus boycott and turned him around and gave him the courage to continue.
God spoke to him at the kitchen table?
Correct. Right. He had just been arrested, and he was going through this agony, but he believed that what he was doing was not only serving God, but serving America. And the last speech of his life, which was less than 12 hours before he was assassinated, that speech, he talked about how extraordinary America was and about the hand of God and how grateful he was that God had allowed him to live and to serve in the time that he did.
Are the progressives trying to take this away from us? Are they trying to take it away in our schools?
Well, they do it with Franklin Roosevelt, too, which is another... See, there's stuff... I studied American history at Yale, and there is stuff that I wasn't taught, that I didn't know about. In the space of 14 months, in the early 1930s, both Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt had near-death experiences that they both understood. It was the hand of destiny sparing them. Franklin Roosevelt had been elected president in a landslide in 1932. He went on a yachting trip to build up his strength before he came to take the oath of office and to become our president. And he was speaking in a park in Miami when he was coming back. There were 5 shots fired at him from 30 feet away. And
none of them hit him?
None of them hit him. There are 3 bystanders who were seriously wounded. The mayor of Chicago, Tony Chermak, was killed. And Roosevelt understood. And by the way, when you listen to his D-Day prayer that he delivers, he says that we are fighting for our faith. He uses that term, and for Christian civilization.
You know, speaking of Roosevelt, I didn't know how bad Henry Wallace was, but he was Roosevelt's vice president. And in the last days, when Roosevelt was his last term, you pointed out so poignantly, there's a convention, and they wanted to put Wallace into nomination for the vice presidency, and Truman's man was chairman, and Claude Pepper is running down frantically. Right. Tell us about that.
No, it's an amazing thing. Henry Wallace is the vice president of the United States. Right. Roosevelt decides to go for a fourth term. He assures Wallace, of course you'll be my running mate, same old team as before. But there was a group, and they were believers. They happened to be devout Catholics. Mm-hmm. There was a group that called themselves the Conspiracy of the Pure of Heart.
Yeah.
Who understood that Henry Wallace had deep communist connections. And he did. And how do we know? Because he renounced that later in his life, after all this was over. And this I had never been taught. And people don't know this about Henry Wallace. He wrote a piece called Where I Was Wrong, where he talks about the profound evil of communism, which he turned against. However, to dump him as vice president required all these things to fall into place. And one of them, as you described, they were about to renominate Vice President Wallace for the vice presidency. Roosevelt dies 82 days into his fourth term. And here's the point, is that Claude Pepper is running down to nominate Wallace, and they gavel the convention into adjournment, and people booed. But that was what they needed to do to go the next day to actually nominate Harry Truman, who, of course, was very much a believer, which is why he recognized Israel against the wishes of his State Department. The entire thing falls into place in such a remarkable way.
Roosevelt dies and Wallace becomes his successor, then he would have moved the country under the Russian orbit. He was a communist in those days.
He was at that point, and the people surrounding him were communist agents, unfortunately. And look, this is the other thing in that same period of time, and this is something, again, most people who even know about Churchill don't know about this. Churchill, Christmas time in 1931, Churchill is visiting New York because he's doing a speaking tour. And he is run down on Fifth Avenue because he's not following the traffic. And a car hits him at 35 miles an hour and comes within inches of squashing his head.
Wow.
And Churchill says, I don't know why I was spared. But of course, he was aware, same way President Reagan was. When President Reagan escaped death, he had a bullet in the chest, as Theodore Roosevelt did. And all of these deliverances, I think what's striking is that our prior leaders looked to see, well, what does this mean?
Yes.
What does this mean? What message is God sending? And I think it's tremendously important that we go back to that.
Let me talk about one thing in the book is that, you know, Alaska was called Seward's Folly because, but here this enormous hunk of land, and Seward apparently, you said he had some kind of a throat condition or had something on.
No, he had a carriage accident. This is one of these unbelievable things that, again, people don't learn about, but I want people to know the story. William Henry Seward, Secretary of State, the Civil War is almost over. He goes out for a carriage ride with his son and his daughter, and he does that on April 5th of 1865. There's a terrible carriage accident. He almost dies. He almost drowns in his own blood. He breaks both the upper and the lower jaw. He breaks an arm. He is badly in terrible shape. They rigged up for him a metal brace over his jaw wound up with canvas. So the night that Lincoln is killed, part of the Booth conspiracy was to send Lewis Powell to Seward's house. They knew that he was sick and lying in bed. Powell brings the knife down 4 times to cut his jugular, and the knife blade hits this metal that he had experienced because of the carriage ride.
He was part of the conspiracy of Booth to kill Seward.
To kill Seward. There was another, George Atzerodt was supposed to kill the vice president, Andrew Johnson, and he got drunk and shaken out. But Powell did it. Powell was hanged for the attempted murder of Secretary of State Seward. But here's the point. Seward, if he hasn't lived, Russian America Russia remains owner of Alaska. And Putin recently, in 2017, they had the 150th anniversary of the sale of Alaska to America. And people close to Putin declared that if they had not given away Alaska, Russia would have won the Cold War.
Incredible.
Would not have fallen apart.
They sold it, what was it, 19 cents an acre or something? Or 18?
Exactly right. And it was totally Seward's doing. Now, here's the other thing, Pat, that nobody knows. During the negotiation for Alaska, Seward has a paper come over his desk as Secretary of State, and he takes it on himself, doesn't consult the president, anything, basically signs his name to acquire a little scrap of land 2.5 square miles in the middle of the Pacific. Midway.
My.
And without Seward doing that, without Seward living through this assassination attempt, without this thing being on his neck,
the Battle of Midway.
The Battle of Midway, which changes the whole course of history, and were the people involved. And again, this it moved me because I didn't know it before doing the book. There was a lead pilot at Midway who was supposed to lead the Japanese into combat, but he had appendicitis the day before, so he wasn't put into combat. His name was Matsuo Fushida, and he had been the lead pilot at Pearl Harbor.
Okay.
He became a Christian because he saw God's hand protecting America and came to America. He appeared with Billy Graham, may he rest in peace, 9 different times, and basically, it was so clear, the miraculous nature of the Battle of Midway, it changed his life.
Well, now, the American aviators were lost, and then they suddenly found Midway. What was the story?
They were coming from 3 different aircraft carriers, the Hornet and the Enterprise and the Yorktown.
Okay.
And they're 3 different squadrons, and they're looking for the Japanese fleet. And they couldn't find it, and they're running out of fuel. And there's a great hero named McCluskey who's saying, no, we have to keep going. They were going to run out of fuel. And all of a sudden, they saw a destroyer, and then they followed, and then the 3 squadrons ran into each other, and they hit. And in 5 minutes, they hit 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers. They sank the 4th later. And it changed the course of all of human history because it won the war in the Pacific.
But Seward had to be alive in order to buy Midway, which was, oh, man.
Right. It's all important to go back to prime cause, right?
Ladies and gentlemen, this is fascinating. God's Hand on America, Michael Medved. If you want to believe in the Lord and His goodness, this is a book that will tell you about it. And I remember what one this particular investor said, I won the ovarian lottery by being born in America, but it's so much more in this book you want to hear. But it's called God's Hand in America. It's just been released. It's wherever books are sold.
Thank
Michael,
you, Pat.
thank you, my friend. God bless.
God bless.